So, in this class, we're going to look at French politics and French society in the new millennium, that is the turn of the year 2000. So, France started off the new millennium in New Year's Eve 1999 with a remarkable bang.
Paris, okay, look at that, that is stunning.
Take a bit of beating.
Surely that would have to be the highlight.
That is rather astounding, isn't it? If we can pause long enough, it would be great to see the Ferris wheels as well. 14 Ferris wheels along the Champs-Élysées, also lit up with fireworks and laser lights, but the Eiffel Tower is smoking.
These are live pictures you're seeing coming in on TV3's 2000 Today broadcast. They're being watched by millions. Thousands and thousands of people beneath it watching.
It just doesn't stop.
There's 10 seconds, we are being told 10 seconds to go in Paris before midnight. Let's watch.
You thought that was it? Oh no.
It's just a build-up.
Count it down.
Here we go. Happy New Year to Paris. Happy New Year to Europe.
Welcome Europe.
Welcome to the millennium. Breathtaking scenes there at the Eiffel Tower in Paris.
Bear in mind, you're seeing these pictures live with the rest of the world. Obviously, half of France is also there in person. These pictures are live from France.
So, France makes a dramatic statement on New Year's Eve 1999 with a very elaborate fireworks display that caught the attention of the world. And on the one hand, obviously the French government wanted to, I suppose the fact they wanted to make this kind of elaborate display in some ways speaks to the fact that there was somewhat uncertainty or growing uncertainty about the divisions that existed within France itself. So presenting a kind of united, spectacular sense of Frenchness in fireworks form, but in France itself, the late 1990s was definitely a period of considerable political tension. The tension could be kind of stemmed back to 1995. We remember François Mitterrand finished up the end of his second term in 1995 and died shortly thereafter. There therefore was an open or a vacancy in the French presidential palace, the Élysée Palace, for the official residence of the French president. The Socialist Party, the Parti Socialiste, had been destroyed in the legislative elections of 1993. So really the question was, what candidate from the French right, what candidate from the French Gaullist tradition would run, because that person would most likely win the election. And the two candidates were, on the right, obviously Jacques Chirac, who we've come across several times, and on the left, Edouard Balladur, who was the the prime minister under Mitterrand during his last 2 years in office. Chirac had deliberately allowed Balladur to go forward as prime minister in 1993 because he wanted to avoid Mitterrand repeating the trick of cohabitation in the mid-1980s, where he ended up getting blamed for all the domestic problems. But Balladur proved to be a pretty popular conservative himself. He essentially adopted many of the right-wing ideas that Chirac had promoted in the 1980s, cutting spending, cutting budgets, cutting taxes. And what Chirac basically found was that once Balladur made it clear in 1995 that he himself had ambitions of running for president, Chirac had to kind of reinvent himself. He simply couldn't run on the policies that Balladur was using, even though Balladur kind of stolen them from Chirac to an extent, because that wouldn't distinguish him himself enough. So instead he had to pivot and present himself as kind of redefine himself as someone who was more concerned with growing inequality in French society, with the growing poverty in France, and also to kind of change his tune on Europe as well. If you remember, Chirac was one of the most outspoken critics of the European integration project. Obviously, Balladur had adopted that more traditionalist Gaullist position, And so in order to kind of present himself to a more moderate voter, Chirac had to change his colours and present himself as a kind of centrist and a supporter of European integration. So kind of very much in contrast to how he presented himself in the past. The Parti Socialiste really didn't have any aspirations of winning the presidential office. At the last minute, they nominated L12 P1, who was the former French Minister for Education during the late 1980s. Really was a more minor figure in the Parti Socialiste. Essentially was being offered up as cannon fodder for what most members of the party considered to be what he was going to face, a heavy electoral defeat. But actually, when it came to the election itself, there was a big surprise in the first round. We remember that the French system generally has a 2-round system. Jospin topped the polls, and he came ahead of both Chirac and Balladur. Not that people necessarily expected that he was going to go on and win the presidency. I think most people understood that once all these candidates had been cleared, that Chirac would probably still win, and in fact, that's exactly what happened. That Chirac won the second round runoff 52% to 47%, but Jospin had performed much better than people had expected, and it kind of reinvigorated the Parti Socialiste, and also kind of set up the political divide between Chirac and Jospin that was to dominate France in the last years of the 20th century. Now that Chirac has been elected president, a lot of people began to wonder, well, what exactly is he going to do as president? Because Chirac had demonstrated throughout his political career that he was always able to kind of change his political colours in order to get into office. And for a long time had been kind of obvious that Chirac's long-term goal was to become French president. But now that he was French president, what kind of government would he try and lead? Because he had changed his own stripes so often in the past. And we remember in the early 1970s, he had first come to attention when he had backed Giscard d'Estaing for president against the wishes of the Gaullist barons. He had then been prime minister for a couple of years. In the 1980s, he had very much been akin in his political and economic philosophy with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, advocating smaller government, budget cuts, lower taxes. But he had to change that position in order to outflank Balladur and win enough centrist votes to become the candidate of the right in 1995. So a lot of people were kind of unsure about what exactly Chirac would do now that he was president. He appointed Alain Juppé as his prime minister, who was more of the kind of traditional conservative 1980s conservative, Reagan Thatcher conservative kind of background. And some of the most interesting changes that were introduced by the Chirac government, or some of the policies that I guess are most noteworthy, are firstly, mandatory military service was abolished under Juppé and Chirac's government. So France had maintained for a long time the idea that all French men were obligated to serve in the military for a period of time to be trained as soldiers. But during the Gulf War, which France participated in as an ally of the United States and the United Nations, a lot of kind of the problems with having a French army that by law actually was not supposed to serve overseas and was not fully professional were kind of highlighted. And so instead, Chirac decided to do away with mandatory military service and to create a smaller but more professional, full-time French army. The most controversial aspect of the Chirac regime in the early years was the decision to restart nuclear testing in the French South Pacific, or the French Polynesia. This was very much Chirac's effort to recast himself in the kind of more traditional Gaullist image of France, kind of doing its own thing and kind of not really caring what the rest of the world thought. Because at this time, of course, most of the rest of the world was trying to move towards limiting nuclear proliferation and trying to reduce the number of nuclear arms. And here France is testing, I think it was 200 nuclear tests in French Polynesia. There was a great deal of backlash both within France and outside of France, certainly at these tests. And eventually the French government signed a treaty in 1996 agreeing to stop testing and to try and reduce its own nuclear arsenal. Of course, the most important part of Juppé's demands to change the French government were to initiate cuts. So basically, by the terms of the Maastricht Treaty, all the countries that were participating in the European Union were supposed to bring their budget deficits in line, not having budget deficits outside a certain kind of a point of spending. And France, like a lot of European countries, was beyond that point of deficit and tried to introduce cuts under Juppé and Chirac. And these cuts were not popular. Not surprisingly, there was a great deal of protest. In fact, in November and December 1995, the wave of strikes that spread across France kind of almost paralyzed the country, and in some ways echoed the in terms of intensity and scale, almost the strikes of May 1968. And this forced Juppé to kind of drop many of his proposals, some of the budget cuts proposals that he had made, which kind of weakened the authority of the government and demonstrated that the kind of French right did not have the kind of dominant control over French politics that it had assumed it was going to have after the dramatic electoral victory of 1993. And it was in that thinking that Chirac decided in early 1997 to call a snap election. A snap election essentially means calling an unscheduled election. If you remember, the French National Assembly, after it is elected, has a mandate to operate for 5 years, after which an election could be called, or had to be called. But the president could call an election anytime he wanted within that 5-year period. Chirac decided to do that in the hope that by calling it early in 1997 as opposed to 1998 when it was supposed to be called, he could ensure that he would have a right-wing majority in the French National Assembly for the rest of his term and wouldn't have to worry about being undercut by a socialist victory in 1998. So, calls for the election to begin, fires the gun, the campaigning begins. Chirac expected, obviously, that he would not have the large majority that the French right had from the 1993 election, but he still hoped enough majority deputies would return that he'd have a solid majority. And what was the result of his decision? Well, it backfired spectacularly. And yes, that is a woman getting hit in the face with a watermelon. It backfires. Basically, the Parti Socialiste is able to cobble together enough allies to win the election. So you see here the plural left, so a variety of different parties: the Socialist Party, Parti Socialiste, the Communist Party, the Green Party, other small left-wing parties are able to cobble together a coalition and to win the election, which is bad news for Chirac because now it means he's faced with a period of cohabitation. Part of the reason for this failure of the French right to retain its control was due to the Front National. And you see this first round and second round elections. In many candidates, the National Front insisted on running candidates in the second round, even though they knew they were not going to win, which diluted the vote of the French right, which helped the French left win the election, which brought us our third cohabitation, that is a prime minister and a president of different political backgrounds for the third time in a little under 12 years, resulting in Lionel Jospin, the guy who lost the election to Mitterrand to Chirac in 1995, becoming the new prime minister of France. And his period as prime minister of France actually proved to be relatively successful, in part because of a global economic kind of upturn, helped decrease French unemployment from about 13% in 1997 when he came to office into under 10% by 2000. So again, France still had issues with unemployment, but there was certainly an improvement in that regard. And Jospin was remembered as a very successful prime minister during the 5 years of his reign. Chirac basically was afraid to call another election, fearing that Jospin would be able to increase his majority, and therefore, for the rest of his reign, was going to be stuck with cohabitation, trying to work with a socialist prime minister, which was certainly not the scenario he envisioned when he called that snap election in 1997.